Kushan Empire, the Rise and Fall. 1. The Forgotten Empire of Central Asia. History often remembers the great empires that shaped the ancient world. Rome with its legions and laws, Han China with its bureaucracy and silk, the Mauryas and Guptas of India with their temples and philosophies. But in between these giants, there was another empire, a bridge between worlds, a forgotten power that once controlled the heart of Asia. This was the Kushan Empire. The Kushans ruled for almost 4 centuries, from the 1st to the 4th century CE. Their dominion stretched from Central Asia to northern India, from the Oxus River in Bactria to the fertile plains of the Ganges. Their land touched the Silk Road, the ancient highway that carried goods, ideas, and faiths across continents. In their time, they were rich, strong, and deeply influential. Yet today, they remain a shadow in popular memory. The story of the Kushan Empire is not just about kings and battles. It is about connections, about how a nomadic people from the steppes created one of the world's most diverse and vibrant states, about how they blended Greek art, Persian religion, Indian philosophy, and Chinese trade into something unique, and about how, like all empires, their strength gave way to weakness and their glory was lost to time. This empire was born from migration and survival. It grew through conquest and diplomacy. It shone through culture and commerce, and it fell under the weight of rivals, invasions, and fragmentation. To understand the Kushans is to understand the crossroads of the ancient world. It is to see how East met West long before Marco Polo or Alexander the Great. It is to watch how power rises in unexpected places, and it is to learn how even mighty kingdoms can fade into dust. So let us journey back to a time when horsemen rode out of Central Asia, to a time when gold coins shone with gods from many faiths, to a time when monks, traders, and soldiers met in bustling cities, the time of the Kushans. 2. Nomadic roots from the Yuezhi to the Kushans. 2nd century BCE. The story of the Kushans begins far from India in the wide grasslands of Central Asia. Around the 2nd century BCE, there lived a nomadic people known as the Yuezhi. They were skilled horsemen traders and warriors moving across the steppes in search of pastures for their herds. The Yuezhi were not a small tribe. Ancient Chinese records like the Shiji, written by Sima Qian, describe them as a confederation of 5 clans. They lived in the fertile lands of Gansu near the Great Bend of the Yellow River. But their world was shattered when another nomadic power rose, the Xiongnu. These fierce horse archers pushed the Yuezhi westward around 176 BCE. The migration was long and harsh. The Yuezhi moved through deserts and mountains, carrying their families, flocks, and traditions. They clashed with smaller tribes along the way. Some groups settled early, others kept moving. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Yuezhi had reached Bactria, an ancient region north of the Hindu Kush Mountains in what is today northern Afghanistan and southern Uzbekistan. Bactria had once been a jewel of Alexander the Great's empire. After his death in 323 BCE, his generals carved up the lands. One of them, Seleucus, ruled the region until it broke away under the Greco-Bactrian kings. Greek cities with stone theaters, gymnasiums, and temples still stood in the valleys. But by the time the Yuezhi arrived, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was weak, battered by constant wars and nomadic invasions. The Yuezhi defeated the local rulers and claimed Bactria for themselves. Here, in a land of crossroads, Greek art, Persian religion, and Indian culture already mixed together. The Yuezhi absorbed these influences while keeping their nomadic spirit alive. Slowly, one clan rose above the others, the Guishuang. Their name would soon be transformed into the word we know today, Kushan. The transformation from wandering tribes to empire builders was not immediate. It took decades of adaptation. Nomads learned to govern cities. Horsemen learned to tax farmers. Traders learned to handle coins instead of barter. The Yuezhi were becoming something new. This moment matters because it shows the first step of their story. The Kushans were born not in isolation, but in movement. Their empire grew out of migration, displacement, and adaptation. Unlike Rome or Han China, which developed from deep roots in one homeland, the Kushans began as outsiders who turned survival into strength. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Yuezhi were no longer just nomads. They were settled in Bactria, watching the trade routes that linked east and west. Their cavalry roamed the mountains, their merchants walked the bazaars, and their leaders dreamed of greater power. Soon, under one man, they would take the leap from tribes to empire. 3. The birth of a new power, 1st century CE. By the dawn of the 1st century CE, the Yuezhi tribes had settled into the fertile valleys of Bactria, but they were still divided, still ruled by 5 chieftains. Each clan controlled its own territory. Each chieftain commanded his own warriors. Unity was fragile. Power shifted from one clan to another, and cooperation lasted only as long as necessity demanded. It was during this time that one leader rose above the rest. His name was Kujula Kadphises. Around the middle of the 1st century CE, most scholars suggest around 45 CE, he united the 5 Yuezhi clans into a single kingdom. This was no small feat. To bring together fiercely independent nomadic chiefs required not only military skill, but also political wisdom. Kujula managed both. Kujula Kadphises is remembered as the true founder of the Kushan Empire. His reign marked the transformation of the Yuezhi from a loose confederation into a centralized power. By adopting the name of the Guishuang clan, the most dominant of the 5, he gave the new state a lasting identity. From now on, the world would know them as the Kushans. Once united, Kujula turned outward. He expanded his power beyond Bactria, pushing into Gandhara and the Kabul Valley regions that lay at the entrance of India. These were not empty lands. They were home to bustling cities, Buddhist monasteries, and trade hubs that connected the Indian subcontinent to Central Asia. By conquering them, the Kushans placed themselves at the heart of trade and politics in the region. Economics played a crucial role in Kujula's expansion. The Kushans were perfectly positioned to control the crossroads of Asia. Caravans passed through their territory carrying silk from China, gems and spices from India, and glassware and wine from Rome. By securing this trade, Kujula ensured that his new empire would grow wealthy. Taxes on goods, tolls on caravans, and the circulation of money filled Kushan coffers. Kujula also understood the importance of symbols. To show legitimacy, he began issuing coins. These coins carried Greek inscriptions, a legacy of the Hellenistic kings who had ruled Bactria before. Some even bore the image of the Greek god Zeus. Others copied Roman emperors. By doing this, Kujula announced to the world that the Kushans were heirs to the great traditions of both East and West. It was a clever message. The Kushans were not just tribal horsemen anymore. They were rulers of an empire. The political system of the early Kushans reflected their dual heritage. They maintained the strength of their cavalry and nomadic traditions, but combined them with city-based administration. Local officials collected taxes. Governors ruled provinces. Trade centers like Taxila and Kapisa flourished under their watch. Militarily, the Kushans proved themselves formidable. Their armies combined mounted archers from the steppes with Indian war elephants and heavily armored cavalry. This blend of tactics gave them flexibility and strength against a wide range of enemies. The rise of the Kushans also reshaped the cultural landscape. In Bactria and Gandhara, Greek art met Indian styles. Buddhist monks carved stupas while artisans produced statues influenced by Hellenistic models. Zoroastrian fire altars stood alongside Hindu temples. This mix of traditions would become a hallmark of the Kushan world. By the time of Kujula's death, probably around 80 CE, the Kushan state was firmly established. It was no longer a cluster of wandering clans, but a rising empire. It commanded wealth, territory, and respect. Its rulers were carving out a place for themselves between Rome, Parthia, and Han China. The birth of the Kushan Empire was in essence a story of transformation. A nomadic people displaced by war had remade themselves into kings. They had taken the inheritance of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians and turned it into something their own. And under Kujula Kadphises, the foundations of a powerful and enduring empire were laid. 4. Geography and heartland. The realm between worlds. To understand the power of the Kushan Empire, we must first understand its land. Geography shaped their destiny. The Kushans ruled from a heartland that was not one world but many worlds connected together. At the center stood Bactria, north of the towering Hindu Kush mountains. This land, with its fertile river valleys and mountain passes, became the base of Kushan power. The Oxus River, today known as the Amu Darya, flowed through its plains, watering fields and feeding trade routes. To the north stretched the steppes, home to other nomads. To the south lay India with its dense cities and rich farmland. The Hindu Kush mountains were both barrier and gateway. Their snowy peaks shielded Bactria from the Indian subcontinent, but narrow passes like the famous Khyber Pass opened the way into Gandhara and beyond. Whoever controlled these passes controlled the movement of armies, merchants, and pilgrims. The Kushans held them, and in doing so, they held power over the crossroads of Asia. Gandhara itself was another jewel of the empire. Located in what is now northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, Gandhara was a land of rivers, fertile valleys, and ancient cities. Taxila, Purushapura, modern Peshawar, and Begram were bustling hubs of culture and trade. Buddhist monasteries rose in its hills, while artisans carved statues that blended Greek realism with Indian spirituality. This region became one of the cultural hearts of the Kushan state. Further south, the Kushans pushed into the plains of northern India. The Ganges River Valley was one of the richest agricultural zones in the world. Fields of rice, wheat, and sugarcane supported dense populations. Cities like Mathura thrived under Kushan rule, producing art, religion, and commerce that linked directly to the empire's core in Bactria and Gandhara. But the Kushan realm was not only about fertile fields and cities, it was also about trade routes. To the west lay Persia and the lands of the Parthian Empire. Beyond them stretched the Roman world, eager for silk and spices. To the east lay China, ruled by the Han dynasty, a giant empire that coveted horses from the steppes and jade from Central Asia. The Kushans sat in between. Their geography gave them the keys to the Silk Road. Caravans moved through their lands carrying Chinese silk, Indian ivory, Persian silver, and Roman glassware. At every checkpoint, the Kushans collected taxes and offered protection. Their cities became markets where goods from distant lands mixed. In Begram, archaeologists later found treasures that told this story clearly: Roman bronze statues, Chinese lacquerware, Indian ivory, and Greek-style glass, all in one place. The Kushan Empire was truly global long before the word existed. Geography also shaped their military strength. The steppes gave them mounted archers, fast and deadly with bows. India gave them war elephants, massive beasts that crushed enemy lines. The mountains trained them to fight in difficult terrain, to use passes and valleys as natural fortresses. They were never just one type of army, they were all of them combined. Culturally, the geography made them a bridge between civilizations. Persian fire worship, Indian Hindu gods, Greek art, and Buddhist teachings all flowed through their territory. The Kushan elite embraced this diversity. They built temples, stupas, and shrines for many faiths. They minted coins with gods from multiple traditions. Their land became a living mosaic. In short, the geography of the Kushan Empire gave it wealth, diversity, and power. It was a realm between worlds, not bound to one culture or one region. The mountains protected them. The rivers fed them. The trade routes enriched them. And the meeting of civilizations defined them. 5. Crossroads of civilizations, the Silk Road, and trade wealth. The Kushan Empire did not survive on conquest alone. Its true power lay in trade. Geography gave the Kushans a rare gift. They sat at the center of the ancient world's greatest highway, the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a web of caravan routes stretching thousands of miles. From China in the east to Rome in the west, traders carried goods, ideas, and stories across deserts, mountains, and seas. The Kushan Empire stood right in the middle. Whoever controlled this land controlled the flow of wealth. From China came silk, fine, shimmering, and in high demand among Roman elites. The Romans in turn sent gold, silver, and glassware eastward. India sent spices, pepper, cotton, and ivory. Central Asia supplied jade furs and strong horses. And through Kushan cities, all of these treasures passed. Caravans entered Kushan lands from the east, moving through the Pamir Mountains and Bactria. They then split south through the Khyber Pass into Gandhara and India, or westward through Persia toward Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. The Kushans taxed these caravans, guaranteed their safety, and built cities to host merchants. Every transaction enriched the empire. One of the most remarkable archaeological finds that proves this wealth is the treasure of Bagram, discovered in the 20th century in Afghanistan. There, in sealed Kushan storerooms, archaeologists found a dazzling mix of objects: Roman bronze statues, glass from Alexandria, Chinese lacquer boxes, and Indian ivory carvings. This collection was not coincidence. It was proof that the Kushans were middlemen in a global trade network. The Kushan kings used this wealth to strengthen their rule. They issued gold coins in vast numbers. Unlike earlier nomads who relied on barter, the Kushans embraced a money economy. Their coins bore inscriptions in Greek Bactrian and later in Indian scripts. On them appeared a fascinating array of gods: Greek Helios, Indian Shiva, Persian Mithra, and Buddha himself. These coins were not just currency. They were political messages showing that the Kushan Empire embraced many cultures and stood at the center of the world. Trade also transformed Kushan society. Cities like Purushapura, Taxila, and Mathura grew into major centers of commerce. Merchants, bankers, and craftsmen flourished under Kushan protection. Monasteries were built along caravan routes, offering shelter to traders and spreading Buddhism in the process. Farmers supplied grain and goods to feed growing urban populations. But wealth brought more than prosperity. It brought cultural exchange. Along with silk and spices came ideas, religions, philosophies, and artistic styles. The Kushans became patrons of Buddhism, supporting the construction of stupas and monasteries. Greek artistic traditions blended with Indian spirituality to create the famous Gandhara style of sculpture, where the Buddha was carved with the flowing robes and realistic features of Greek statues. At the same time, the empire absorbed influences from Persia and Rome. Zoroastrian symbols appeared in their temples, Roman diplomatic missions reached their courts. Chinese chronicles recorded Kushan envoys arriving in Han capitals carrying gifts and messages. The Kushans were not isolated. They were fully engaged in the politics and diplomacy of the ancient world. Economically, this position at the crossroads gave the Kushans immense stability. Unlike purely agrarian empires that depended only on harvests, the Kushans had multiple sources of wealth. Trade brought them silver and gold. Agriculture in the Ganges plain supplied food. Taxes on cities and caravans kept their treasury strong. This combination allowed them to fund armies, build monuments, and maintain authority over a diverse population. Yet this wealth also made them targets. To the west, the Parthians and later the Sasanians wanted control of these routes. To the east, the Han Chinese sought to secure their silk trade. To the south, Indian kingdoms challenged Kushan power. Being in the middle meant prosperity, but it also meant constant pressure from great powers. Still, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Kushans managed to balance these forces. They were not just participants in the Silk Road economy, they were masters of it. Their empire thrived because they knew how to turn geography into advantage and trade into power. 6. The reign of Vima Kadphises. 9127 CE coins, power and expansion. After Kujula Kadphises united the Yuezhi tribes and laid the foundation of the Kushan state, his successors built upon his work. Among them, one ruler stands out as a key figure in the rise of Kushan power, Vima Kadphises. His reign, lasting from around 90 to 127 CE, was a turning point. It was during this time that the Kushans began to shine as a true empire. Vima Kadphises inherited a strong base in Bactria and Gandhara. But he was not content with what his father had built. He pushed further, expanding into northern India. The Kabul Valley and Gandhara became firmly secured, and his forces moved into the fertile lands of the Indus and the Ganges plains. These territories were not only rich in agriculture, but also sat on critical trade routes linking Central Asia to the heart of India. By bringing them under Kushan control, Vima opened the door to immense wealth. One of his most important contributions was the introduction of gold coinage. Before Vima, most Kushan coins were made of copper and silver, but Vima Kadphises struck gold literally. His gold coins were modeled in part after Roman aurae, reflecting the empire's participation in international trade. Roman demand for silk and spices was enormous, and gold flowed eastward in payment. The Kushans took this gold and minted their own currency, spreading it across their territories. These coins were more than money. They were symbols of legitimacy and power. On them appeared not only the king's image, but also gods from multiple traditions. The sun god Helios, the moon god Selene, the Indian god Shiva, and Zoroastrian deities were all featured. This reflected the diversity of the empire and projected the message that the Kushan kings were rulers of many peoples and many faiths. Economically, Vima's reign was one of prosperity. Control of the Silk Road gave the Kushans steady revenue. Taxes on caravans filled their treasury. Indian agriculture supplied food and raw materials. Urban centers like Mathura flourished under his rule, producing art sculpture and trade goods. Buddhist monasteries received patronage and pilgrims traveled freely through the empire. Politically, Vima Kadphises established the Kushans as a recognized force among the great powers. The Romans traded with them indirectly through Parthia, but Kushan coins modeled on Roman styles show how closely the two worlds were linked. Chinese sources mention contacts with the Yuezhi, suggesting that the Kushans were also engaging diplomatically with the Han dynasty. To their west, they balanced relations with the Parthians, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals. Militarily, Vima's conquests were decisive. His forces combined the skills of nomadic horse archers with the power of Indian war elephants and heavy cavalry. This gave the Kushans flexibility on the battlefield. Their armies could fight in the mountains of Afghanistan, the plains of India, or the deserts of Central Asia with equal effectiveness. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Vima Kadphises was preparing the empire for its golden age. By expanding into India, by strengthening trade, and by creating a gold-based economy, he laid the groundwork for the reign of his successor, one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world, Kanishka the Great. Vima Kadphises is sometimes overshadowed in history by the fame of Kanishka. Yet without him, the Kushan Empire might never have reached its peak. He turned a rising kingdom into a wealthy, expanding power. He gave it the coinage that fueled its economy, the land that fed its people, and the connections that tied it into the wider world. When Vima Kadphises died around 127 CE, the Kushan Empire stood tall. It controlled Central Asia and northern India. It was wealthy, stable, and respected. The stage was set for the empire's most glorious chapter. 7. Kanishka the Great, 127–150 CE, the apex of the empire. When Vima Kadphises died around 127 CE, his successor ascended the throne. His name was Kanishka, and he would become the most famous of all Kushan rulers. To many historians, Kanishka is remembered as Kanishka the Great. Under his leadership, the Kushan Empire reached its peak in power culture and influence. Kanishka inherited a wealthy and stable realm, but he was not content to maintain it. He was ambitious, energetic, and bold. His reign combined military conquest with cultural patronage, diplomacy, with religious transformation. He built an empire that was vast and diverse, stretching across Central Asia and deep into India. Militarily, Kanishka expanded the frontiers of the Kushan state farther than any ruler before him. In the north, his forces moved through the Pamirs and into parts of Central Asia, securing trade routes that connected directly to China. In the south, his armies advanced across the Ganges Valley, taking cities and bringing fertile lands under Kushan control. Gandhara, Kashmir, and Mathura all flourished under his rule. His empire at its height touched the Oxus River in the west, extended across northern India, and reached into Central Asia. Like Alexander the Great centuries earlier, Kanishka understood that conquest was only one part of empire building. He consolidated his rule by establishing strong centers of power. His capital at Purushapura, modern-day Peshawar, became the heart of his empire. From here, he administered a realm that was not only vast, but also culturally diverse. Kanishka's reign is often celebrated for his patronage of Buddhism. According to Buddhist tradition, he convened the Fourth Buddhist Council around 147 CE in Kashmir. This council became a defining moment in Buddhist history, helping shape Mahayana Buddhism and spreading it across Asia. Under Kanishka, Buddhist monks received patronage, monasteries were built, and stupas rose across the land. The most famous of these was the Kanishka Stupa at Purushapura. Ancient Chinese pilgrims like Faxian and Xuanzang centuries later described it as a towering structure, said to be among the tallest buildings of the ancient world. Its gilded pinnacle shone like a beacon, visible for miles. It was both a symbol of Kushan devotion and a monument to their wealth and ambition. But Kanishka was not only a Buddhist king. His coins reveal a ruler who embraced many faiths. On them appear deities from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Buddhist traditions. Helios, Shiva, Mithra, and Buddha all found a place. This was no accident. It reflected the cosmopolitan nature of his empire. Kanishka ruled over people of many cultures and beliefs, and by honoring them all, he bound them together under his authority. Economically, Kanishka continued the policies of his predecessors. Trade along the Silk Road thrived. Roman gold poured into his empire in exchange for silk spices and luxury goods. Caravans carried Chinese lacquerware, Indian ivory, and Persian silver through Kushan territory. The empire's position at the crossroads of Asia made it one of the wealthiest states of its time. Culturally, his reign saw the flowering of Gandhara art. In workshops across Gandhara and Mathura, sculptors blended Greek realism with Indian symbolism to create images of the Buddha unlike any seen before. The serene, robed figures with finely carved features became the standard for Buddhist art across Asia. These images traveled with monks and merchants to China, Korea, and Japan, shaping the visual language of Buddhism for centuries. Kanishka also understood diplomacy. Records show that his empire maintained contact with both the Roman and Han empires. Envoys traveled across Asia carrying gifts, messages, and trade agreements. The Kushans were recognized as one of the great powers of the world. They were not merely local rulers. They were participants in a global system of empires. Yet Kanishka's greatness was not only in expansion and wealth, it was in vision. He saw his empire not as a collection of lands, but as a bridge. A bridge between East and West, between nomads and farmers, between Greek art and Indian faith, between local traditions and global networks. He made the Kushan Empire into a meeting place of civilizations. By the time of his death around 150 CE, Kanishka had left a lasting mark. His empire was larger than ever. His patronage had transformed Buddhism into a world religion. His coins, art, and monuments reflected a state that was wealthy, diverse, and confident. Under Kanishka the Great, the Kushan Empire stood at its true apex. 8. Buddhism and beyond the cultural bloom under Kanishka. The reign of Kanishka the Great was not remembered only for conquests and wealth. It was remembered for culture, for faith, and for the extraordinary flowering of ideas. More than any other ruler, Kanishka turned the Kushan Empire into a beacon of religion and art. At the heart of this transformation was Buddhism. Before Kanishka, Buddhism had already spread across India. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka centuries earlier had supported the faith. Monks had traveled, stupas had been built, and teachings had been written. But under Kanishka, Buddhism took a bold new step. It became a world religion. According to tradition, around 147 CE, Kanishka convened the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir. This gathering of monks and scholars was one of the most important moments in Buddhist history. Texts were recited, doctrines debated, and interpretations recorded. The council gave strong support to the Mahayana school of Buddhism, which emphasized the idea of the bodhisattva enlightened beings who delay their own nirvana to help others find salvation. This vision was powerful. It appealed to a wide audience. It gave Buddhism a universal message, one that could travel beyond India. Under Kushan patronage, Mahayana Buddhism spread rapidly along the Silk Road. Monks carried scriptures and statues into Central Asia and China. From there, the faith continued to Korea and Japan. In many ways, Kanishka's support was the spark that lit the global journey of Buddhism. But the Kushan cultural bloom was not limited to religion. It was also visible in art. The Gandhara region under Kushan rule became one of the greatest artistic centers of the ancient world. Sculptors there created images of the Buddha that were unlike anything before. Influenced by Greek art, these statues showed the Buddha with realistic features, wavy hair, and flowing robes that looked like Roman togas. At the same time, Indian symbolism remained the lotus, the wheel, the gestures of teaching and meditation. This fusion created the Gandhara style, which became the model for Buddhist art across Asia. In parallel, the Mathura school of art in northern India flourished, producing statues with more Indian features and spiritual intensity. Together, These two schools gave Buddhism both diversity and strength in its artistic expression. Kanishka's empire also embraced many other religions. His coins showed gods from different traditions: the Iranian Mithra, the Indian Shiva, the Greek Helios, and Buddhist figures as well. This was more than decoration. It was a message. It said that the Kushan Empire was a home for many faiths, that its ruler honored them all. In a realm of traders, pilgrims, and settlers, this tolerance created stability. People of different beliefs could find a place under Kushan rule. Society itself reflected this diversity. In the cities of the empire, one might find a Greek-speaking merchant, an Indian craftsman, a Persian priest, and a Chinese monk all walking the same street. Monasteries stood beside temples. Markets sold goods from across continents. The Kushan world was cosmopolitan in the truest sense. Economically, this cultural bloom was supported by wealth from trade. The Silk Road carried not only goods, but also ideas. Buddhist monks traveled with caravans. Artists met foreign patrons. Philosophies were exchanged alongside silk and spices. The Kushans did not simply guard these routes, they nourished the exchange that flowed through them. Politically, Kanishka understood that supporting culture strengthened his rule. By backing Buddhism, he won the loyalty of monks and pilgrims. By honoring many gods, he kept peace among diverse subjects. By funding art and monuments, he left a visible mark of authority. Culture was not separate from power, it was part of it. The Kanishka stupa at Purushapura symbolized this vision. Ancient accounts describe it as a wonder of the world towering hundreds of feet high. Its golden pinnacle shone in the sunlight. Pilgrims traveled from far lands to see it. It proclaimed to all that the Kushan Empire was rich, powerful, and devoted to the sacred. The cultural bloom under Kanishka reminds us of the empire's unique position in history. It was not just a conqueror's state. It was a place where civilizations met and blended. Greek sculpture, Indian spirituality, Persian deities, and Chinese pilgrims all found a home there. Out of this mix came art, religion, and ideas that changed the world. When we remember the Kushans, we must remember this legacy. They were not only warriors and kings, they were patrons of a global culture. And under Kanishka, that culture reached its most brilliant height. 9. Governance and society, kings, elites, and everyday life. An empire is not built by kings alone. Behind the conquests and monuments of the Kushans stood a society diverse, complex, and held together by systems of governance. To understand their strength, we must look at how the Kushans ruled and how ordinary people lived under their rule. At the top stood the Kushan king. He was more than a monarch. He was the symbol of unity for a realm that stretched across mountains, deserts, and fertile plains. The king's image appeared on coins, his name inscribed on inscriptions, his presence felt in temples and stupas. He was a military leader, a patron of religion, and the supreme judge of his people. The royal court was filled with nobles, military commanders, and advisors. Many came from different backgrounds. Some were descended from the original Yuezhi clans, nomadic warriors turned aristocrats. Others were local elites from Bactria, Gandhara, or northern India brought into the administration. This blend reflected the empire itself, nomadic roots mixed with settled traditions. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials loyal to the king. They collected taxes, ensured law and order, and maintained communication with the court. Records show that Kushan governance combined flexibility with control. Local rulers often kept their positions if they pledged loyalty. Cities managed their own markets and guilds. Buddhist monasteries acted as both religious and economic centers, supporting trade and education. Coins were a key tool of governance. Issued in copper, silver, and gold, they were widely circulated. They bore not only the king's portrait, but also inscriptions in Greek Bactrian or Indian scripts. By using multiple languages, the Kushans acknowledged the diversity of their subjects and ensured their authority was understood everywhere. Religion also played a political role. By honoring many gods on their coins and monuments, Kushan rulers sent a clear message all faiths were welcome under their rule. This religious inclusivity was a form of governance. It reduced tensions in a multi-ethnic empire and gave the king legitimacy across cultural boundaries. Society itself was layered. At the top were the elites, royal families, nobles, and wealthy merchants. Below them stood craftsmen, farmers, and soldiers. Farmers in the Ganges plain grew rice, wheat, and sugarcane to feed the cities. Artisans in Gandhara carved statues of the Buddha mixing Greek and Indian styles. Traders carried goods across mountains and deserts. Soldiers guarded the borders and protected caravans. Buddhist monks formed another important group. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also economic players. Monasteries often owned land, received donations, and served as safe havens for travelers. They helped spread literacy and preserved texts, making them centers of learning as well as worship. The everyday life of common people in the Kushan Empire was shaped by both tradition and diversity. A farmer in Mathura might visit a Hindu shrine while his neighbor worshipped the Buddha. A merchant in Bagram might pray at a Zoroastrian fire altar before joining a caravan. A craftsman might carve statues of the Greek god Heracles while wearing clothes dyed with Indian indigo. This blending of cultures was part of daily existence. Women in Kushan society played varied roles. In urban centers, some managed households of wealthy merchants, while others participated in crafts and trade. In rural areas, women worked alongside men in farming. Religious art from the period also shows female figures, sometimes divine, sometimes symbolic, reflecting both respect and complexity in gender roles. Military service was another element of social life. The Kushan army was made up of many groups: nomadic horse archers from Central Asia, elephant corps from India, heavily armed cavalry, and foot soldiers from the cities. For many men, military service was both duty and livelihood, tying them to the state. Urban life thrived in the empire. Cities like Purushapura and Taxila were bustling with markets, temples, and workshops. Roads and caravanserais connected them, making the movement of goods and people easier. Guilds organized craftsmen and traders, setting standards for quality and prices. Education and culture were linked to religion. Buddhist monasteries taught scriptures, philosophy, and languages. Greek influence still lingered in education, especially in Bactria, where Greek traditions had taken root centuries earlier. This combination created a society that valued learning and exchange of ideas. Governance and society in the Kushan Empire were not perfect. Taxes could be heavy, local rebellions did occur, and managing such a diverse empire was always a challenge. Yet for centuries, the system worked. The Kushans balanced central authority with local autonomy, and they gave space for cultures and religions to coexist. This is why the Kushan Empire stood out. It was not only a realm of conquest, it was a realm where nomads became kings, where trade became the lifeline, and where society itself became a blend of civilizations. In their governance and in their daily lives, the Kushans showed the world that diversity could be strength. 10. Military power, cavalry, war elephants, and strategy. No empire of the ancient world could survive without strong armies. The Kushan Empire was no exception. From their earliest days as nomadic tribes, the Kushans understood that power rested on the strength of their warriors. But when they transformed into kings, they combined the skills of the steppes with the resources of the settled world, creating one of the most versatile military forces of the ancient era. At the heart of the Kushan military was the cavalry. The Yuezhi ancestors of the Kushans had been horsemen for centuries. On the steppes of Central Asia, survival depended on speed, mobility, and archery. This tradition carried into the empire. Kushan horse archers could move swiftly across the battlefield, unleashing volleys of arrows before withdrawing to strike again. These tactics had once made nomads like the Scythians and Parthians feared by settled empires, and under the Kushans, they remained vital. But unlike purely nomadic forces, the Kushans also drew from the resources of their new lands. From India, they adopted the war elephant, massive creatures armored and trained to charge enemy lines. A Kushan army marching with elephants was both terrifying and effective. Few forces could withstand the shock of a charging elephant corps, especially when combined with volleys of arrows from mounted archers. The Kushans also developed heavy cavalry. Some warriors rode into battle wearing scale armor, wielding long lances, and supported by chainmail-clad horses. This style mirrored the cataphracts of the Parthians and later the Sasanians. These soldiers could smash through infantry formations, giving the Kushans strength in direct combat. Infantry played a supporting role. Armed with spears, swords, and shields, they guarded supply lines, garrisoned cities, and supported cavalry maneuvers. In sieges, infantry would have been essential, using engines and ladders to storm fortifications. The mix of horse archers, heavy cavalry, elephants, and infantry made the Kushan army flexible, able to fight on open plains, in mountain passes, or against city walls. Their strategy reflected their geography. The Kushans ruled lands of mountains, deserts, and river valleys. They needed armies that could adapt to all conditions. In the Hindu Kush, cavalry dominated narrow passes. On the plains of India, elephants gave them the edge. In Central Asia, fast-moving horsemen guarded trade caravans against raiders. The Kushan military was not only about battle, it was about control. Soldiers protected the Silk Road, ensuring that merchants could travel safely. They defended caravanserais, patrolled borders, and collected tribute. The empire's wealth depended on trade, and its army ensured that trade flowed without interruption. Diplomacy also relied on military strength. Neighboring powers like the Parthians, Romans, and Han Chinese respected the Kushans because of their armies. Envoys could negotiate confidently, knowing that behind them stood warriors who could defend the empire's interests. Even distant Rome and China knew that the Kushans were not to be underestimated. One important feature of the Kushan military system was its diversity. Just as their empire was a mosaic of cultures, so too was their army. Soldiers came from many backgrounds: nomadic horsemen, Indian elephant riders, Bactrian infantry, and artisans who built siege engines. This diversity gave the Kushans the ability to wage war on multiple fronts. Religion and ideology also tied into military power. Coins often showed the king in warrior pose, standing beside gods of war like Heracles or Shiva. This imagery reinforced the idea that the ruler was divinely favored, leading his people into battle with heavenly protection. Victories were not just political, they were spiritual affirmations of the king's legitimacy. Yet maintaining such an army was costly. War elephants required vast resources, food training, and care. Cavalry needed high-quality horses, armor, and weapons. Soldiers had to be paid, equipped, and organized. The prosperity of the Kushan Empire made this possible for a time, but as pressures mounted in later centuries, sustaining such forces would become more difficult. For now, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Kushan military stood strong. It was the shield of trade, the spear of conquest, and the backbone of royal power. It embodied the fusion of nomadic tradition and settled wealth. And it gave the Kushans the means to hold their vast, diverse empire together. 11. Relations with the Roman Empire and Han China, the Kushan Empire, was never an isolated kingdom. Its power came not only from soldiers and farmers, but from its place between giants. To the west stood the Roman Empire. To the east stretched Han China. Both were among the greatest powers of the ancient world, and the Kushans stood right in the middle, linking them through trade diplomacy and at times rivalry. With Rome, the connection was mostly economic. Roman citizens loved silk. By the 1st century, CE senators, aristocrats, and wealthy merchants draped themselves in fine Chinese fabric. But the Romans could not buy silk directly from China. Instead, it traveled westward along the Silk Road, passing through Central Asia, Persia, and Kushan lands before reaching Roman markets. The Kushans became crucial middlemen. Caravans carried silk, spices, ivory, and gemstones from India through Kushan-controlled routes. In exchange, Roman gold poured eastward. Archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Vast numbers of Roman gold coins have been found in India, especially in Kushan-era sites. These coins often show the faces of emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, and Trajan. They were not used as money in the same way in India, but as bullion ornaments and treasures. The Kushans profited from this exchange, taking their share of taxes and tolls. There are also signs of direct contact. Roman authors wrote about embassies from India and Central Asia reaching Rome. Though details are scarce, it is clear that the Kushans were part of the wider diplomatic world. In Roman eyes, the Kushans were exotic, but important keepers of trade routes that Rome desperately needed. With Han China, relations were both diplomatic and strategic. The Chinese knew the Kushans as the Da Yuezhi, the Great Yuezhi. Chinese records like the Ho Hanshu Book of the later Han describe envoys traveling between the Han court and the Kushan kings. One famous account tells of a Kushan envoy arriving in Luoyang, the Han capital, in 158 CE. He brought gifts of ivory tortoiseshell and other luxuries. In return, the Han emperor sent silk and lacquerware. These exchanges were more than symbolic. They cemented political ties and secured trade. But the relationship was not always smooth. The Han dynasty wanted to control the western regions of Central Asia, especially the Tarim Basin, where cities like Khotan and Kashgar sat on the Silk Road. The Kushans also wanted influence there, since those routes connected directly to their heartland. At times, this led to friction. Both sides knew that whoever dominated Central Asia could control the flow of silk horses and jade. Yet there was also cooperation. The Kushans and Han China shared an interest in keeping nomadic raiders at bay. The Xiongnu and later other steppe tribes threatened both empires. By maintaining ties, the Kushans and Han could balance against these common enemies. Diplomacy also served cultural exchange. Chinese Buddhist pilgrims later credited the Kushans with helping transmit Buddhist texts into China. The famous monk Lokaksema, who traveled to Luoyang in the late 2nd century CE, translated Mahayana scriptures from Sanskrit into Chinese. This was possible because of Kushan patronage of Buddhism. In this way, diplomacy was not only about politics, but also about religion and ideas. For the Kushans, these relationships were vital. With Rome, they gained wealth. With China, they gained legitimacy and partners. By standing between the two, the Kushans made themselves indispensable. They turned geography into advantage. Few other empires could claim to be so deeply tied to both the Western and Eastern superpowers. This position, however, also carried risks. If Rome or China shifted their policies, the Kushans felt the consequences. If trade routes were blocked, their economy suffered. Being the middleman brought great rewards, but it also meant constant pressure to maintain balance. Still, during the height of their power under kings like Kanishka, The Kushans managed this balance masterfully. Their embassies reached the courts of emperors, their goods filled foreign markets, and their influence stretched across continents. In the grand story of East and West, the Kushans were the link that made the Silk Road truly global. 12. Economy of gold trade. Taxation and prosperity. The Kushan Empire was built on wealth, not the fleeting riches of plunder, but steady, enduring prosperity that flowed from trade, agriculture, and taxation. Their economy was one of the strongest in the ancient world, and it allowed them to support armies, build monuments, and sponsor religion and culture. At the core of this prosperity stood the Silk Road. Every caravan that traveled between China and Rome passed through Kushan lands. From the bustling cities of Bactria to the river valleys of India, the Kushans controlled the checkpoints, passes, and markets that made trade possible. They taxed goods, offered protection, and maintained order. In doing so, they turned geography into gold. The goods moving through their empire were dazzling. From China came silk, lacquerware, and jade. From India came spices, cotton, ivory, and precious stones. From Rome came glass, silverware, wine, and coins. Central Asia contributed strong horses' furs and metals. All of this passed through Kushan markets, where merchants from different lands bargained, exchanged, and paid their dues to Kushan officials. The result was immense wealth. Unlike many empires which relied heavily on farming alone, the Kushans had multiple streams of income. Agriculture provided food and raw goods. Trade brought foreign treasures. Taxes on caravans and cities ensured a steady flow into the treasury. This diversified economy gave the Kushans resilience. The most visible sign of their wealth was their coinage. Starting with Vima Kadphises and perfected under Kanishka, the Kushans issued gold coins in massive quantities. These coins were widely circulated across Central Asia and northern India. They were thick, heavy, and beautifully struck, showing kings on one side and gods on the other. Kushan coins reveal much about their economy and society. First, they proved the empire had access to enormous amounts of gold, much of it arriving from Roman trade. Second, they show the importance of communication. Inscriptions appeared in Greek, Bactrian, and Indian scripts, making them understandable across a multilingual empire. Third, they doubled as propaganda. By placing deities from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Buddhist traditions on their coins, the kings proclaimed their authority as rulers of a diverse population. Urban centers were another key to the economy. Cities like Purushapura, Bagram, Mathura, and Taxila were thriving hubs of production and commerce. Craftsmen made goods for both local use and international trade. Ivory carvings, stone statues, and metalwork traveled as far as Rome and China. Guilds of merchants and artisans helped regulate prices and standards, giving stability to markets. Agriculture remained the backbone of everyday life. In the fertile Ganges Valley, farmers produced wheat, rice, sugarcane, and cotton. In Gandhara, fertile river valleys grew grains and fruits. Irrigation supported larger harvests, and surpluses fed armies, cities, and monasteries. The Kushans taxed this produce, taking a share to support their administration and military. Religion also played an economic role. Buddhist monasteries were not just places of worship, they were centers of wealth. Monks received donations from kings and merchants, and monasteries often owned land. They supported travelers on trade routes and acted as safe havens for caravans. In return, they helped stabilize the system that fed Kushan prosperity. But prosperity was not without challenges. The very position that gave the Kushans wealth also made them vulnerable. If war disrupted the Silk Road, their revenues fell. If Rome restricted imports of silk, as some emperors tried to do, the flow of gold slowed. If rival powers like the Parthians or later the Sasanians seized territory, Kushan trade routes were threatened. Still during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Kushan economy was remarkably strong. It supported massive building projects like the Great Kanishka Stupa. It funded armies of cavalry and elephants. It allowed kings to strike coins in gold, a luxury most rulers could not afford. The Kushans proved that an empire at the crossroads of trade could thrive not by conquest alone, but by turning movement into money. Their economy of gold was both the symbol and the foundation of their power. 13. Religion in diversity. God's temples and beliefs. One of the most remarkable features of the Kushan Empire was its spiritual landscape. Unlike many kingdoms that tried to impose one religion, the Kushans embraced many. They ruled over lands where faiths from India, Persia, Greece, and Central Asia met. Instead of forcing one tradition, they made room for all. This religious diversity became both a symbol of their empire and a tool of their governance. The coins of the Kushans tell this story clearly. On one coin, you might see the Indian god Shiva holding his trident and accompanied by his bull. On another, the Greek sun god Helios blazes with rays around his head. On others still appear Persian deities like Mithra or Buddhist images of the Buddha himself. No other empire of the ancient world displayed such a wide pantheon on its money. Each coin carried a message the Kushan king was protector of all faiths, ruler of a diverse people. Temples, monasteries, and shrines reflected this pluralism. In Gandhara, Buddhist stupas rose beside Hindu temples. In Bactria, Zoroastrian fire altars glowed with eternal flames. Greek-style statues still stood in older cities. Pilgrims, merchants, and priests moved freely across the empire, finding support for their traditions. Buddhism held a special place, especially under Kanishka. His patronage of the Fourth Buddhist Council and his support for Mahayana Buddhism made the empire a turning point in the history of the faith. Buddhist monasteries flourished in Gandhara, Kashmir, and Mathura. Monks traveled along the Silk Road carrying texts and statues to Central Asia and China. The Kushans became guardians of a religion that would spread across half the world. But Hinduism was also strong. The fertile Ganges plains brought under Kushan control were heartlands of Hindu belief. Temples dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva stood in cities like Mathura. Kushan kings, by placing Hindu gods on their coins, acknowledged the devotion of their Indian subjects. From Persia came Zoroastrianism. The fire cult of Ahura Mazda had long been present in Bactria, and it continued under the Kushans. Fire temples symbolized purity and divine order. Kushan rulers included Zoroastrian deities on their coins, showing respect for this tradition as well. Greek influences lingered too. Even though the Hellenistic kingdoms of Bactria had fallen centuries earlier, their gods and artistic styles remained. Heracles appeared on Kushan coins wielding his club. Helios, Selene, and other Greek deities reminded subjects of the region's classical heritage. This blending of religions was not mere tolerance. It was a deliberate policy. By honoring many gods, the Kushan rulers strengthened their legitimacy. Each community could see their faith reflected in the symbols of power. Each subject could feel included in the empire. In a land as diverse as the Kushan realm, this was essential for stability. The religious diversity also had cultural consequences. Artists drew on many traditions at once. Buddhist statues in Gandhara showed the influence of Greek realism. Hindu images in Mathura carried local styles, but were patronized by Kushan kings. Even Zoroastrian symbols blended with Indian motifs. The result was a unique artistic fusion, a reflection of the empire's spiritual mosaic. For ordinary people, this diversity shaped daily life. A merchant in Taxila might pray to Shiva before setting out, then make an offering at a Buddhist monastery along the road, and finally pass a Zoroastrian fire temple in Bactria. A craftsman might carve statues of the Buddha for one client and images of Helios for another. Faith was not separate from life, it was woven into the fabric of society. This pluralism also made the Kushan Empire a safe haven for religious travelers. Buddhist monks moving from India to Central Asia found protection. Persian priests serving fire temples could perform rituals without fear. Greek settlers kept their traditions alive. The empire became not just a political crossroads, but a spiritual one as well. The religious diversity of the Kushans was more than tolerance. It was their identity. It showed the world that they were not bound to one culture, but stood at the meeting point of many. This was their strength, and it left a legacy that endured long after the empire itself disappeared. 14. Seeds of decline, political fragmentation after Kanishka. Every empire has a peak, and after the peak decline often begins not suddenly but slowly through cracks that widen over time. For the Kushan Empire, this turning point came after the death of Kanishka the Great, around 150 CE. His reign had marked the Golden Age, but his successors could not match his energy, vision, or strength. The first sign of weakness was political fragmentation. After Kanishka, the empire remained large, but unity began to fray. Later Kushan rulers, such as Huvishka and Vasudeva Vasan, still controlled vast territories. They continued to mint coins and patronize temples, but over time central authority weakened. Provincial governors gained more independence. Local elites asserted their own power. The empire became less a unified whole and more a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions. The causes were many. The Kushan realm was enormous, stretching from Central Asia to the Ganges. Maintaining such control required strong kings, efficient administration, and constant military presence. Without leaders of Kanishka's caliber, the balance faltered. Communication across mountains and deserts was slow. Governors far from the capital in Purushapura could act without fear of immediate royal oversight. Economics also played a role. The empire's prosperity had depended on the steady flow of trade. But disruptions began to appear. Roman emperors worried about gold leaving their empire tried to restrict the import of silk. Conflicts in Central Asia sometimes blocked caravan routes. With less revenue from trade, the Kushans had fewer resources to pay soldiers and officials. Externally, pressures mounted. To the west, the Parthians still competed for control of trade. By the mid-3rd century CE, they were replaced by the rising Sasanian Empire, a far more aggressive and centralized power. The Sasanians sought to dominate Central Asia, directly challenging Kushan authority. To the east, the Han dynasty in China also faced decline and disorder, which disrupted the Silk Road further. The delicate balance that had enriched the Kushans began to collapse. Culturally, the empire remained vibrant. Art and religion continued to flourish. Buddhist monasteries thrived in Gandhara and Mathura. Coins still bore diverse gods, but culture alone could not hold the empire together. Politics and economics mattered, and both were weakening. One telling sign of decline was the division of the empire into eastern and western halves. By the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, it is likely that one line of rulers controlled territories in Afghanistan and Central Asia, while another line ruled in northern India. This division diluted power. Instead of one strong empire, there were multiple Kushan kingdoms, often vulnerable to stronger neighbors. Military strength also declined. Maintaining elephants, cavalry, and heavily armored soldiers required wealth. As revenues shrank, so did the ability to keep armies at full strength. Rival powers seized the opportunity. Borderlands once secure now became contested. Still, the decline was gradual. For many decades after Kanishka, the Kushans remained significant. They continued to influence trade, patronize religion, and maintain cities. But beneath the surface, the seeds of fragmentation had already taken root. The empire that had once stood as a bridge between Rome, Persia, India, and China was beginning to break apart. The fall of the Kushans would not come in one dramatic collapse. Instead, it would come step by step through weakened kings, divided provinces, shrinking revenues, and the rise of stronger rivals. The Golden Age was over. What followed was a slow struggle to hold on to greatness, even as the world around them changed. 15. Pressures from the West. The rise of the Sasanian Persians, 3rd century CE. The 3rd century CE was a century of challenges. For the Kushans, one of the greatest threats came not from the east or the south, but from the west. There, a new dynasty rose in Persia, the Sasanians. They would become one of the most formidable powers of late antiquity, and their ambitions clashed directly with those of the Kushans. The Parthians who had once ruled Persia were loose in their organization. They allowed rivals like the Kushans room to maneuver. But in 224 CE, Ardashir I overthrew the Parthians and founded the Sasanian dynasty. Unlike their predecessors, the Sasanians were centralized, aggressive, and eager to revive the glory of ancient Persia. They claimed to be heirs of the Achaemenid kings like Cyrus and Darius, and they sought to restore Persian dominance across Central Asia. For the Kushans, this was dangerous. Their western territories included Bactria and regions along the Oxus River lands that the Sasanians also coveted. Control of these regions meant control of key silk road routes. It also meant access to fertile valleys and strategic fortresses. In the decades after Ardashir's rise, conflict grew. Shapur Lumpur, his successor, launched campaigns eastward. Inscriptions and reliefs left by Shapur boast of victories over the Kushans. At one point, the Sasanians even claimed overlordship of Bactria and Gandhara, suggesting that parts of the Kushan realm fell under their influence. The Kushans resisted, but they were already weakened by internal fragmentation. Divided between eastern and western branches, they struggled to present a united front. Local rulers may have acknowledged Sasanian authority in exchange for retaining some autonomy. In effect, the Kushans were becoming vassals in their former western heartlands. Economically, this was a major blow. The Sasanians controlled routes that had once enriched the Kushans. Trade between India and the West could now be diverted through Persian channels, reducing Kushan profits. The empire's position as the key middleman was eroding. Militarily, the Kushans faced an enemy as sophisticated as themselves. The Sasanians also fielded heavily armored cavalry, skilled archers, and disciplined armies. Their state was tightly organized, their resources vast. For the Kushans, whose strength had relied on wealth from trade sustaining long wars with Persia, was difficult. The Sasanian challenge was not just military or economic, it was also ideological. The Sasanians promoted Zoroastrianism as their state religion. Fire temples rose across Persia, and priests played a central role in governance. This contrasted with the Kushans, who embraced diversity and pluralism. For subjects in contested lands, the Sasanians offered a vision of order and tradition rooted in ancient Persia. Some may have seen them as more legitimate rulers than the increasingly divided Kushan kings. By the mid-3rd century, the balance of power had shifted. The Sasanians had taken control of much of western Central Asia. The Kushans, once dominant in Bactria, were pushed eastward, forced to consolidate their power in Gandhara and northern India. This retreat marked the beginning of the end. Yet the Kushans did not vanish overnight. In India, they still held Mathura and other cities. They continued to issue coins and sponsor temples. but their days as masters of Central Asia were over. The rise of the Sasanians had cut away a crucial part of their empire. For centuries, the Kushans had thrived as the empire at the crossroads linking Rome, Persia, India, and China. Now, with Persia under Sasanian control, that bridge was broken. The empire survived, but it was no longer the power it once had been. 16. Indian Challenge. The Gupta Empire rises 4th century CE. As the Kushans lost ground in the west to the Sasanians, new dangers emerged in the south. In northern India, a fresh power was rising, the Gupta Empire. By the 4th century CE, this dynasty would become one of the most celebrated in Indian history. But for the Kushans, it marked another stage of decline. The Kushans had long held parts of northern India. Cities like Mathura Kapisa and Purushapura were under their control, and the fertile plains of the Ganges brought food and wealth. But the Kushan grip was weakening. Internal divisions, shrinking revenues, and losses to the Sasanians left them vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped the Guptas. The Gupta dynasty began modestly in the eastern Ganges plain. Around 320 CE, Chandragupta I established himself as a strong ruler, forging alliances through marriage and conquest. His successors, notably Samudragupta and Chandragupta II, expanded the realm with remarkable speed. By the mid-4th century, the Guptas controlled much of northern India, including regions once dominated by the Kushans. The Gupta rise was both political and cultural. Their kings projected themselves as champions of Hinduism. They patronized temples, revived Vedic traditions, and supported Sanskrit literature. This contrasted with the Kushans, who had ruled as foreign conquerors, with a pluralist approach to religion. Many local elites in India found Gupta rule more appealing, since it was rooted in native traditions. Militarily, the Guptas proved formidable. Inscriptions describe Samudragupta's campaigns across India. His armies defeated rival kings, subdued tribes, and extended Gupta influence deep into the subcontinent. Against such pressure, the fragmented Kushans could not compete. Economically, the Guptas benefited from controlling the Ganges Valley, one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. This wealth gave them the means to maintain armies and reward loyal allies. The Kushans, by contrast, had already lost key trade routes in the west. Their resources were dwindling just as the Guptas were rising. By the early 4th century, the Kushan Empire had effectively split. The western half in Afghanistan and Bactria was under heavy Sasanian influence. The eastern half in northern India still survived, but as a shadow of its former self. These eastern Kushans, sometimes called the Little Kushans by historians, continued to mint coins and rule small territories. But they were no longer a great power. The Guptas absorbed much of this territory. Mathura, once a major Kushan city, came under Gupta control. So too did large parts of the Ganges plain. By the time Chandragupta II ruled in the late 4th century, the Guptas had established themselves as the dominant force in northern India. The fall of Kushan power in India had deep consequences. The Guptas ushered in what many call the Golden Age of India, marked by advances in mathematics, astronomy, art, and literature. But the foundations of their rise were built in part on the ruins of the Kushan state. The empire that had once brought Buddhism, trade, and cultural fusion to India was replaced by one that celebrated Hindu revival. For the Kushans, this was a loss not only of land, but of identity. Their base had shifted from Central Asia to India over the centuries. With the Guptas in control, their last strongholds dwindled. What remained of the Kushan name survived only in small, fragmented kingdoms, soon to be swept aside by even harsher invaders. The 4th century thus marked another step in the unraveling of the Kushan Empire. From the west, the Sasanians pressed. From the south, the Guptas expanded. and the once great bridge of Asia was reduced to fragments, surviving only on the edges of power. 17. The Hephthalites and nomadic invasions, 5th century CE. By the 5th century CE, the Kushan Empire was already a shadow of its former self. The Sasanians had taken their western lands. The Guptas had absorbed much of their Indian territory. What remained were scattered Kushan principalities in Gandhara, the Kabul Valley, and parts of northern India. Yet even these fragments would not last. A new storm gathered on the steppes, the invasion of the Hephthalites, also known as the White Huns. The Hephthalites were a nomadic people, fierce horsemen, who swept out of Central Asia. They shared much with earlier steppe confederations, mobility archery, and a talent for exploiting weakness in settled states. By the mid-5th century, they began pressing into Bactria and Gandhara regions, once securely under Kushan control. For the Kushans already weakened by centuries of decline, the arrival of the Hephthalites was devastating. Their armies could not match the speed and ferocity of these nomadic raiders. Cities that had once thrived under Kushan rule like Purushapura and Taxila came under attack. Trade routes that had sustained the empire for centuries were disrupted once again, this time by relentless waves of steppe cavalry. The Hephthalites did not just raid, they conquered. By around 460 CE, they had carved out a dominion stretching from Central Asia into northern India. They absorbed the last remnants of Kushan territories, reducing the once great empire to vassal states, or obliterating them entirely. Local Kushan kings survived in name, only paying tribute to their new overlords. This invasion marked the final blow to Kushan power. The empire that had once acted as a bridge between Rome, Persia, India, and China was now broken apart. Its lands became battlegrounds for steppe nomads, Persian armies, and Indian dynasties. The consequences were severe. The Buddhist monasteries that had flourished under Kushan patronage now faced destruction. Some survived by moving further east into Central Asia and China, where the faith continued to thrive. But in Gandhara, the heart of Kushan Buddhist art, many sites were abandoned or destroyed. The Gandhara style, which had once blended Greek realism with Indian spirituality, faded from history. Economically, the fall of the Kushans and the rise of the Hephthalites disrupted trade along the Silk Road. Caravans faced new dangers. Routes shifted further north or south to avoid unstable territories. The great role of the Kushans as middlemen between empires ended forever. Culturally, however, the Kushan legacy lived on. The Hephthalites, like many conquerors before them, absorbed parts of the culture they destroyed. They used coins modeled on Kushan designs. They tolerated Buddhism in some regions, even as they brought destruction in others. Traces of Kushan influence survived even as the empire itself disappeared. The decline under the Hephthalite invasions also highlights a recurring theme in Central Asian history. Nomadic empires rise, dominate, and collapse in cycles. The Kushans themselves had once been nomads sweeping into Bactria after being displaced by the Xiongnu. Now, centuries later, they fell to another wave of nomads. The cycle had come full circle. By the end of the 5th century, the Kushan name was no longer associated with power. Their territories were gone, their armies broken, their capitals captured. What survived were scattered memories, coins buried in the ground, ruined stupas, and faint mentions in the chronicles of other empires. The Hephthalites had erased what centuries of prosperity and culture had built. Yet the Kushans were not entirely forgotten. Their art, their role in spreading Buddhism, and their legacy as a bridge between civilizations remained. Even in destruction, their influence continued to ripple across Asia. 18. Legacy of the Kushans, art, religion, and ideas. Though the Kushan Empire collapsed under the weight of invasions and rival empires, its legacy did not vanish. In many ways, the Kushans left behind a cultural and religious footprint larger than their political one. Their empire, once a crossroads of civilizations, continued to shape Asia long after their armies and kings were gone. Perhaps their most enduring legacy was in art. The Gandhara style, born under Kushan patronage, spread across the Buddhist world. The image of the Buddha as a serene figure with flowing robes carved in stone with lifelike detail began in Kushan lands. Before this, Buddhism had avoided depicting the Buddha in human form, choosing instead symbols like footprints or wheels. Under the Kushans, influenced by Greek art, the Buddha gained a face, a body, and an expression. This image traveled east with monks and merchants, reaching China, Korea, and Japan. To this day, the standard image of the Buddha owes much to the artistic fusion fostered by the Kushans. Religion was another field where their influence was profound. The Kushans became major patrons of Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana school. By supporting the Fourth Buddhist Council and sponsoring monasteries, they helped turn Buddhism into a global religion. The texts translated during their time made their way into Central Asia and China. Monks like Lokaksema carried Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese cities where they were translated and studied. Without Kushan support, Buddhism's spread across Asia would have been slower, perhaps even uncertain. At the same time, the Kushans did not enforce one religion. Their coins, temples, and art show a remarkable pluralism. They honored Hindu gods like Shiva, Persian deities like Mithra, and Greek figures like Helios. They welcomed Zoroastrian fire altars, Hindu shrines, and Buddhist stupas. This openness set an example of coexistence in a diverse empire. It showed that unity could be built not by suppressing difference, but by embracing it. Economically, the Kushans shaped trade for centuries. By controlling the Silk Road, they helped establish patterns of exchange that endured long after their fall. Even under the Sasanians and later powers, the routes and markets built in Kushan times continued to function. The treasure found at Bagram Roman glass, Chinese lacquer, Indian ivory remains one of the clearest examples of how global their world had become. Politically, their empire showed what nomads could achieve when they settled. The Yuezhi had once been displaced wanderers. Under Kujula Kadphises and his successors, they became kings, administrators, and builders. Their success demonstrated that nomadic peoples were not only destroyers, as so often portrayed, but creators of lasting states. This pattern would repeat later with other steppe peoples like the Turks and Mongols, who also built empires that shaped the world. Even in decline, the Kushans left marks. The Hephthalites and other invaders who replaced them adopted Kushan coinage art and some elements of governance. The Guptas, who absorbed their Indian territories, inherited cities and traditions shaped by Kushan rule. In this way, the Kushans lived on in the states that followed them. In memory, however, they faded. Unlike Rome or Han China, whose records and monuments survived, the Kushans were forgotten for centuries. Their stupas crumbled, their inscriptions eroded, their cities buried. Only in the modern era, through archaeology and study, have they been rediscovered. And yet, when we look closely, their influence is everywhere. In the face of the Buddha carved in Chinese caves, in the gold coins that still gleam from the soil of Afghanistan and India, in the patterns of trade that connected Asia long before the modern age. The legacy of the Kushans is not just a story of power lost. It is a story of ideas, art, and faith carried forward. It is a reminder that even empires that vanish from memory can leave behind gifts that shape the world for centuries. 19. Rediscovery by modern historians and archaeologists. For centuries after their collapse, the Kushans were forgotten. Unlike Rome with its marble ruins or China with its detailed chronicles, the Kushans left behind little that survived the passing of time in plain sight. Their empire slipped into obscurity, remembered only faintly in scattered texts. It was not until the modern age, through archaeology coins and inscriptions, that the Kushans re-emerged, their story pieced together once more. The first clues came from coins. Farmers and villagers in northern India and Afghanistan often dug up strange gold and copper coins while plowing their fields. These coins bore the names of kings Kujula Vima, Kanishka, Huvishka, Vasudeva. They showed figures of kings in armor and gods from many traditions. For 19th century European scholars and local antiquarians, these discoveries were astonishing. Here was evidence of a powerful dynasty unknown to mainstream history. Numismatics, the study of coins, became the key to unlocking the Kushan past. By comparing coin inscriptions in Greek Bactrian and Brahmi scripts, scholars reconstructed royal lineages and established timelines. The wealth of Kushan coinage confirmed what ancient Roman and Chinese writers had hinted, that this empire was once rich, powerful, and deeply connected to global trade. Archaeology added more pieces to the puzzle. In the 20th century, excavations at sites like Bagram in Afghanistan uncovered treasure hoards. Among the finds were Roman glassware, Chinese lacquer, and Indian ivory, all stored together in Kushan storerooms. This single discovery proved the empire's central role in global commerce. Bagram became the clearest symbol of the Kushans as middlemen of the ancient world. Other excavations revealed the grandeur of Kushan religious life. At Purushapura, the capital of Kanishka, archaeologists identified the remains of the great Kanishka stupa. Though the towering structure itself no longer stands, the foundations showed its immense scale. Chinese pilgrims' descriptions of the stupa as one of the tallest monuments in the world suddenly seemed believable. In Gandhara and Mathura, sculpted figures of the Buddha and Hindu deities revealed the artistic brilliance of the Kushan era. The blending of Greek and Indian styles, once only a theory, could now be seen in stone. The Gandhara Buddhas, with their lifelike features and flowing robes, became recognized as one of the greatest artistic achievements of antiquity. Textual sources also played a role in rediscovery. Chinese histories, such as the Hohanshu, mentioned envoys from the Da Yuezhi, confirming contacts between the Kushans and Han China. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder spoke of trade with India and lands beyond, hinting at Kushan involvement. Buddhist texts preserved legends of King Kanishka's council and his patronage of the faith. By comparing these scattered references with coins and archaeology, historians slowly rebuilt the narrative of the Kushan Empire. The rediscovery of the Kushans also changed how scholars viewed world history. Once the focus had been only on great civilizations like Rome, China, and India. The Kushans showed that Central Asia was not a mere frontier, it was a core region where cultures met and flourished. They reminded the world that history is not only about the famous empires, but also about those forgotten powers that linked continents together. Today, the Kushans are studied as one of the great empires of antiquity. Their story is taught as part of the history of the Silk Road of Buddhism and of cross-cultural exchange. Museums display their coins, statues, and artifacts as treasures of a world once overlooked. In Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, the ruins of their cities and monasteries still whisper of an age when their empire shone brightly. The rediscovery of the Kushans was like unearthing a missing piece of history's puzzle. It showed that the ancient world was far more connected than once believed, and it gave back to the Kushans their rightful place among the great empires of the past. 20 Tiksu. Conclusion. The empire at the crossroads of the ancient world. The story of the Kushan Empire is a story of movement, transformation, and connection. From their beginnings as nomads driven westward by the Xiongnu in the 2nd century BCE, the Yuezhi became rulers of cities, patrons of religion, and masters of trade. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE under kings like Kujula Kadphises, Vima Kadphises, and Kanishka the Great, the Kushans stood at the height of their power. Their lands stretched from Central Asia to northern India. Their wealth flowed from the Silk Road. Their culture blended the traditions of Greece, Persia, India, and China into something entirely unique. They were not just conquerors. They were builders. They were connectors. They issued coins in gold-carved stupas that reached for the sky and supported artists who gave the Buddha his face. They turned diversity into strength, ruling over Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians, and others without suppressing their beliefs. Their empire showed that tolerance and inclusivity could be the foundations of power just as much as armies and fortresses. But like all empires, the Kushans faced challenges. After Kanishka, political fragmentation weakened their unity. Trade, the lifeline of their wealth, was disrupted. As Rome struggled, China declined, and Persia revived. The Sasanians cut away their western lands in the 3rd century CE. The Guptas rose in the south in the 4th century, and by the 5th century, the Hephthalites swept over their remaining strongholds. Piece by piece, the empire fell apart. Yet their fall does not erase their legacy. The Kushans played a crucial role in spreading Buddhism across Asia. They left behind art that reshaped religious imagery for centuries. They proved that the Silk Road was not just a line of trade, but a corridor of ideas, languages, and cultures. They showed that Central Asia was not a backwater, but one of history's great crossroads. For centuries they were forgotten, their memory buried in coins and ruins. But today, thanks to archaeology and scholarship, we can see their importance clearly. The Kushans were not as well known as Rome, Han China, or the Mauryas, yet they were just as vital in shaping the world of antiquity. Their story is a reminder that history is not only written by the most famous empires. It is also made by those in between, by the connectors, the traders, the mediators. The Kushans were exactly that, an empire at the crossroads. Their rise and fall is part of the great human story of how civilizations meet, mix, and transform one another. And so the Kushan Empire stands as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning that wealth and power, however great, are never eternal, and an inspiration that culture, art, and ideas can outlast kingdoms, carrying their memory across centuries. This was the Kushan Empire, born of nomads, enriched by trade, glorified by art, sustained by diversity, and remembered today as the forgotten empire that once held the heart of Asia in its hands.